All right, so it's been a while. It's middle October, and I've just finished reading So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, which is the fourth book in the um, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy trilogy. Right, fourth book out of five in the trilogy. Um, I think there's a very clear delineation from. I think there's a very clear delineation between where the trilogy ends and then where these next two books pick up. Um, I don't remember the last book very well off the top of my head, but if I remember correctly, they're very much based on this kind of like rewriting of what was initially believed or was initially set up in the first trilogy. Because a huge part of the first trilogy is obviously that Earth blows up and it no longer exists. And then we get to this point in which all of a sudden, no, it didn't actually blow up. But, it's kind of hard to explain because I think the fifth book explains it a little more, in which the replacement for Earth basically comes in immediately as soon as the original Earth blows up, right? And, along with that, everyone like goes in this whole conspiracy theory of, or I should say, they fully believe that like it was a hallucination that occurred of all these things happening, right? But yeah, I think it's an interesting way to kind of cover back up and go back into the world that we were once exploring, but I really do kind of like the way that the third book really wrapped up a lot of things, versus this where we're kind of entering into a whole new world of trying to have to rewrite things and whatnot. I've talked a lot about the philosophy of a lot of these other books. I didn't pick up on a lot of it in this book. That could just be a personal issue of mine of just not picking up on it. But this book overall just seems to follow a much more like linear story path, of just kind of like resetting up the world. One of the great things that happens is Arthur Dent finds two other people in the world that were like him, right? Is that we have God, what's the girl's name? Fenchurch. We have Fenchurch, who he meets that has like memories of kind of this real world, as it once was. And it's a really cool, interesting thing, because the way that I initially read it was, this, right? Because initially, in one of the first books, we get the introduction of this girl that is the person who finds the answer that humans were created for, right? They generate the question, but in reality, they don't really generate the question in the end here. It's kind of all a little bit confusing. So like that whole story arc kind of gets a little bit muddled. But right, like Arthur Dent finds Fenchurch, who is like him, in which she has this kind of memory of this not being a hallucination, of it being a real event that happened. And they go and they meet God, what's his name? See, now I'm getting all confused because I'm reading so many different goddamn things at the same time. But they meet the sane one. I don't remember his name at the top of my head. And they go through and they kind of realize that they all have these bowls that were left to them as gifts by the dolphins, and supposedly, I guess these are the only 3 people that have them. You know, it's not really kind of commented on, but you know, it's number one, a kind of realization that like humans, according to this, were actually the third smartest being on the planet, because initially we had the mice from book one and book two, that were the smartest beings, and now the dolphins are also one of these like super intelligent beings, right? And so, you know, we kind of live in this weird thing in which, you know, we're having to rewrite a whole bunch of stuff in order to make everything work. And then, yeah, like overall, this book is set as much more just like kind of like a standard setup. You know, there's a fun, you know, romantic part in it. And there's a whole bunch of like reunification stuff that's happening of like, you know, Ford and Arthur back together, and then we see Marvin, and then we see the shutdown of Marvin, right? Because Marvin has apparently lived the entire existence of the universe 27 times over. But yeah. You know, I guess to focus on the end, because that's the only part that like I can really think of to really talk about. You know, we have the death of Marvin, which is a really like interesting concept, because it goes back to this idea that like, as was kind of talked about in the first book or two with Marvin, is that, you know, it's a super intelligent being that never really gets fully realized in its, you know, conception of, you know, you have this hyper intelligent being, but you've given it human emotions, and then you've put it in a human body. So because it's not part of this AI system that's part of like a ship or something, it suddenly like decreases its value, right? Because inherently there's this idea that computers or AI are smarter than humans, so therefore by putting it in a human body, you are giving the human characteristics with it, right? And so, you know, Marvin lives the entirety of the world, the entirety of the universe 27 times over, never being fully realized. And I think it's the great symbolization of that is through its, you know, the talk of like, it had this one bad thing that hurt it. I don't remember what it described it as, but has this one bad part in it that's been constantly hurting it. And out of everything that's ever been replaced, that's the one thing that's ever been replaced, right? And we get like this whole, you know, thing of, you know, if something has emotion, you know, do we have to honor those emotions and honor those feelings? All right. And if that's the case, right, in this AI in which we should follow these emotions and honor them, then do we have to then do a whole bunch of research and findings into what animals can and cannot, and then also then going back and honor those, right? What is our duty of care in existing, right? So that's an interesting little thought experiment. And then of course the, you know, ending, you know, sorry for the inconvenience, of, you know, these are God's final words to creation in general and the world in general, of, you know, sorry for the inconvenience. And, you know, all the characters walk away satisfied. And Fenchurch says that that's what she was told, or had come to her in that one envisionment of life that, you know, a whole bunch of this is based off of, or this portion of the story is based off of. And I don't know, it's just one of those weird kind of, I don't think it does the series service. I think it comments really well, and I think fits really well with this kind of like a nihilistic things don't matter, and therefore we should just kind of live our lives and do what we want sort of, idealization that a lot of these books have kind of gone into, that like we are allowed to explore and do whatever we want because things don't inherently matter, and so therefore we're allowed to create, we're allowed to explore. But I feel very much like it is rather than something that's like, if philosophical and witty and interesting, it's quippy to be quippy, right? It is focusing too much on, I think, the first three books, the things that got pulled for, what quotes are and things like that, and not necessarily the philosophical standpoint that I would argue the first three books are really great at. Yeah, it doesn't feel genuine. It feels very much like, oh, here's a fun little, quip, a wit to the end, but not necessarily something that is like inherently interesting or intriguing. But yeah, that's that. I certainly didn't enjoy this one as much. I would probably rank this the lowest out of these four so far. I mean, just, I just thought there's as much to it. I just didn't enjoy it as much. But yeah, that is So Long, and thanks for all the fish.